Hello. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out tonight, especially all my 134 students. You guys pay attention, you may learn something. So, first of all, I'll get my thank yous out of the way. Pat Miller, thank you very much for all your help. I'd like to thank the Miller Lecture Funds, Carl Roberts, Teresa Tashima, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Department of Sociology, Department of Latino Studies, the graduate students in sociology. So when I was trying to put together an introduction for Dr. Koval, I remember going to one of those websites, rateyourprofessor.com, I believe it is, where students talk about the professors, good or bad, and all that. And one comment about Dr. Koval kind of stuck in my head, and I'll read it to you guys. This professor is so nice and understanding. He looks like Santa Claus, and he seems to be the ideal American. So I know these are pretty high remarks, the ideal American, but I think they fit Dr. Koval pretty well. When I began my master's work at DePaul University, I was lucky enough to kind of fall into the hands of Dr. Koval. And we would talk a lot about sociology, about politics, about life. And I remember he would always or often talk about fighting the good fight, helping everybody, trying to improve the quality of life for all people, fighting the good fight. And it really made an impact on me. And in one way or another, I try to fight this good fight every day, whether it be through teaching or through my work. And it really did make an impact on me. And before I came here to Iowa State to finish my studies, I asked Dr. Koval for some advice. And he gave me two pieces of advice. His first piece was, work your ass off, which, was good advice, and I have been following that advice. And his second advice to me was, fight the good fight. So, thank you very much for that, and I'd like to introduce John Koval from DePaul University.
Thanks, Ryan. Just for the heck of it, I like to pick up on that Santa Claus notion. A few years ago, I was down in North Carolina at a university at a birthday party for some East African relatives of my wife. And at the birthday party, I was standing with kind of a drink in my hand and talking to some East African males who were also part of a local community. And a little black kid kept circling me and circling me and circling me. And he's about maybe 5 or 6, I guess maybe 6. And finally tugged my hand, and I bent over, and he looks at me, he says, "Are you Santa Claus?" And I had to disappoint him. Anyway, let me tell you a little bit more about myself, I suppose, and how I come to be up here in a way. I work in sociology of work. I'm interested also, as Ryan well knows, in sociology of leisure, which doesn't mean what most people think it means. Also, I've taught for a long, long time courses in sociology of sport. But in the area of sociology of work, I've spent the last several years mostly concentrating in, primarily because of the things that you are probably intimately familiar with and maybe a little afraid of. And that's that thing we call the changing economy, the global economy, and what it means for work and labor in the United States. Superimposing that over large-scale immigration in this country that is started in 1965, and in terms of, say, numbers, if not proportions yet, the largest immigrant population that the U.S. has ever seen. And also very distinctive in that, unlike my own personal background, where my parents came from Eastern Europe, these are now new immigrants, not from Europe, not from a traditional Christian culture necessarily, but from the East, South America, also Mexico, obviously. And for those of us who measure it in different kinds of ways, if you look at Middle Eastern countries, small numbers from each Middle Eastern country, but you lump them all together in terms of, say, religious affiliation, a very sizable segment of Muslims, certainly in the Chicago area and other parts of the country. I like to reflect on my own background. I spent part of the summer doing some family tree research, and I visited a little village in southern Poland. They used to be part of Slovakia, but given the politics of geography in Eastern Europe, at one time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then became a part of Czechoslovakia, and then later is now a part of Poland, where I visited my grandfather's place of birth in a little town called Chernogora. I shouldn't say town, a small village. And did some family research and found it kind of fascinating to know that this man who probably couldn't speak English, probably was illiterate, left Chernogora at the age of 20 with his wife and a 1-year-old firstborn, and somehow made his way, I don't know how, to Bremen, Germany, took a boat from Bremen, Germany to Baltimore, and again somehow found his way to Joliet, Illinois. I assume that famous thing that we now call social networks were at work, and very shortly ended up being in Chicago. And in the 1910 census, I find that he's listed as a butcher. And he lives on 38th and Sealy, which is the south side of Chicago. And so I assume he worked in those famous Chicago stockyards for most of his life. He came in 1899, became a naturalized citizen in 1924. My father was the second born, the first born of his family in the United States. He had 7 brothers and sisters. Moved to Los Angeles with the beginning of his family in 28, and my dad was a truck driver all his life. I'm from a family of 9 children, and one of the amusing things about immigration that I was sharing over dinner this evening was how that notion, what goes around comes around, and sometimes what goes around bad comes around bad again. And I had the interesting experience when I was in college, your age, going home one weekend. I went to school in Seattle, and just asking my dad, how are things? And he sputters out, the goddamn Mexicans, the goddamn Mexicans. And I say, what's the matter? What's the matter? Now they're stealing all the jobs and they're breeding like rabbits. And I stopped and I said, how many children in our family? That's exactly the same thing that was said to you in 1935, you know? And it's very disappointing that we, even in your own family, you don't learn from history yourself. So I have a strong kind of emotional affiliation, and I hope that doesn't blind too much the kind of research that I'm doing, looking at immigrants, and particularly looking at immigrants that are also damned almost universally without recognizing what they do bring to this country, what they contribute, and how much that is, and in many, many, many ways, how certainly major portions of our country and major portions of our city couldn't function without the immigrants that we have. So, all that said, the city I teach in, the city I live in, the city of Chicago has been known for a long time as an immigrant capital of the United States. And it's been defined or identified, labeled as one of the 5 major immigrant cities in the United States. Would you guess whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? Could you suggest what other cities might be major immigrant cities in this country in terms of absolute numbers? New York. Pardon? San Francisco? Los Angeles, right. We know Chicago. No. Miami. And San Francisco, okay? Number 1 is New York. Number 2 is Los Angeles. Number 3 is San Francisco. Number 4 is Miami. Chicago is number 5, okay? And one of the first things that I thought I would kind of orient you to, although I'm going to be talking mostly about the Mexican labor force, the largest immigrant labor force in the city of Chicago, and the largest immigrant labor force in this country, not only just Latino, but Mexican, okay? But to kind of put that in a little perspective, I want to start a little bit out showing you kind of what kind of context we're talking about. And so I projected up yonder here the top 20 immigrant communities in the city of Chicago. And I think maybe most of you can see them, but I'm going to step away for a minute and I'll have to yell a little bit. Show my hand, yeah. We've got Mexico here. Can anybody hear me, by the way? So we're doing the 5: Mexico, Poland, India, the Philippines, the former USSR, that is grouping all the new republics of the USSR together, China, Korea, Yugoslavia, Germany, Italy, Guatemala, Pakistan, Greece, the UK, Canada, Vietnam, Ecuador, Romania, Ireland, and Japan. And the numbers you can't probably see, but one of the things that's somewhat important is that Mexican immigrants in Chicago are larger than the remaining 15 largest immigrant groups in the city of Chicago. I mean, we're talking big, all right? A lot of immigrants. Another thing that is somewhat interesting in the eyes of Chicagoans in particular, and for some people who look at immigration, now the majority of Mexicans live in the Chicago suburbs rather than the city of Chicago. So the old notion that immigrants come and live in urban ghettos is partially true, but I think because of the changing nature of our economy, and certainly I think in the city of Chicago, where the city itself is becoming a banking center, a commerce center, an investment center, and our manufacturing and production facilities have moved to the suburbs, Mexicans have gone to the suburbs for their work also. So we have a huge, not huge, about 52% of all Mexican origin people in the city of Chicago or the metropolitan area of Chicago live in the suburbs on the one hand. Let me just run you through stuff that I hope isn't dry. The numbers are always a little bit saying, oh my God, this guy going to throw numbers at us all night long. But what it begins to talk about are people who are contributing to kind of the social dynamic of an area, and if you will, in what magnitude and in what proportion we're beginning to get certain kinds of mixes that are extremely different than we have in the past. And I know I have almost arguments with colleagues who work in the area of immigration who make the case that we really need to look at the immigrations of the past from 1840, say, to 1920 and learn from them so we will be able to deal more relevantly and more effectively than with immigrants in the present. And I am in a minority, I think, who make the case that I don't think there's that much utility, that the world has changed too much, our world has changed too much, that, let's say for a simple little example, we have a very high dropout rate of Mexican males and females in high school in the city of Chicago, which is a national phenomenon. About 45% of all kids who enter the 9th grade don't graduate from high school. The same thing happened to Irish immigrants, Polish immigrants, Italian immigrants at the turn of the century. And for similar kinds of reasons, I think. But when they got their heads screwed on and decided they wanted to go to work at 28, 29, and 30 after doing whatever they did between the time they dropped out, they were able to get jobs in manufacturing, an exploding economy of manufacturing that paid them pretty good jobs, and they got up in mobility. Okay? That same phenomenon of dropping out is occurring with many contemporary immigrants like Mexicans, but the economy has changed. There aren't those kind of jobs for unskilled that are growing and expanding and have opportunities for upward mobility. So to me, a major concern, I use kind of inflammatory language, I suppose, but I'm saying the second generation of Mexicans in this country are a time bomb economically. When they are trying to make a living, they're going to have one hell of a hard time. Okay? So what we have going is, in Chicago right now, this mix is about 55%. This is the Chicago metro area. If you're not familiar with Chicago, we always talk about the collar counties. So there's the city of Chicago and 6 collar counties. So, and Chicago is in Cook County, as many of you may know. So this is the Chicago metro area with about 55%, well, it's white, non-Latino, about 19 or 20%, if you will, black, 6% Asian, and 20% Latino. So if you like, one of the things we have is as white Anglo. By now, this is 2000 data. By now, in 2005, we might be talking about Anglos in the city of Chicago being in the minority, and Asian, Black, and Latino in the majority if you cluster them together. Okay. Let me run you by some other things that are simply part and parcel of the reality that a place like Chicago looks like and deals with. Chicago defines itself as a city of neighborhoods, which is true, but somehow it never tells you as well as it could or as much as it should that Chicago is a city of ethnic and racial neighborhoods. In some cases we call them ghettos, in some instances we may call it racial or ethnic segregation. But it seems to me in many cases the choice also occurs where many immigrant groups choose to live in homogeneous communities for mutual self-support, and that occurs an awful lot also. So here's what Chicago looks like in terms of ethnicity and race. So what we've got, what we have here, this funky looking green here, here, and here is African American. So that famous thing in Chicago called the Chicago South Side, here is the Chicago South Side. Chicago West Side, African American, farther west, okay? Mexican is this kind of golden yellow. These are high density. And what we did, and let me share this with you now, we used a simple measure referred to statistically as an ROI, an index of representation. And what we did was look at, by census tract, what was the proportion of African American, what's the proportion of Mexican, and what's the proportion of Korean by census tract. And any census tract in which they were more than 2 times their expected representation, that is, if let's say if 10% of the city or metropolitan area of Chicago is a Mexican, it's more like 20%, but I'm using 10 for convenience. If it's 10%, then we'd say all other things being equal, everywhere we would look, we'd find 10% Mexican in all census tracts. In areas where it's 20% or more, we identify those as a kind of density, okay? Or African American, the same thing. So we have, again, African American, Mexican here. One of the distinctive things about Chicago in terms of its immigrant patterns, it has a long history of immigration from the East and Eastern European countries, especially Polish, and we also have fairly large numbers of Poles. So the third largest immigrant group is Pole, and we're looking here at this light blue. So the Poles have pretty much moved out of the city into the suburbs here and into the southwest suburbs. And in reality, these are kind of geographical extensions of where the Polish communities were in the city of Chicago. Again, in sociology, we use terms like ethnic secession. And it's kind of interesting because I ask Mexican students that I have, what neighborhood do you live in? And they say, I live in Pilsen. And I say, do you know where that name came from? No, I have no idea where Pilsen came from. I said, well, my father at one time was living in Czechoslovakia, or we came from Czechoslovakia, and Pilsen was the community the Bohemians identified their neighborhood in the city of Chicago. It was Pilsen. And they moved out to Cicero in the suburbs as they got upward in geographic mobility. So now Mexicans are living in Pilsen, and guess what? As they get upward mobility, they now are the largest ethnic minority not the largest ethnic minority, the largest population in Cicero. They've replaced, pardon me, many people view being bohunk as a slur, but if you're from that background, you can say it's not a slur. So there's been more dispersion now of traditional ethnic groups that came to this country. And so Cicero is now trying to, quote, deal with its Mexican population, and doing so in extremely strange ways, So, for example, while the majority of people living in Cicero are Mexican, not surprisingly, the power structure is still white. And so the power structure passed city ordinances that it was illegal for more than 4 teenagers to be in a car at the same time, and the car would be taken, okay? And this obviously is to prevent Mexicans from Mexican young males in particular from scooting around town in 4 and 5 guys in a car. They have ordinances against how many people can live in a house versus how many rooms. Because when you're poor and you come to a city like Chicago, and particularly if you're single, as many Mexican males are, they do not understand why they should waste their money in renting a one-room apartment for $800 a month and pay it themselves. So they bring in 6 or 7 or 8 of their friends, okay? And they share the cost, because one of the things that Mexicans do is send money home, which we label remittances. And the largest source of federal income, or the second largest in the country of Mexico, is money being sent back to Mexico by Mexican nationals working in this country. The only other industry that produces more income for the country of Mexico is oil. It used to be tourism, but about 6 or 7 years ago, remittances in the billions of dollars go back to Mexico. Okay. But for middle-class Americans, it becomes exceedingly difficult. It's a testing situation, you know, to have 3 beat-up pickup trucks parked in front of a house. The lawn isn't being taken care of, and you know, we like trim lawns and clean new pickup trucks, and that's not part and parcel of the background that Mexicans bring to the culture. So it produces attention, and understandably so. We also have, again, I said, large numbers of Asians to the country, and most of the Asians also live in the suburbs. A lot of Koreans went to the north side of the city of Chicago. They are now elsewhere. Also, Korean is the boom, 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 where are we? It's like pink, Korean, okay. If you're not familiar, let me ask you this question if I could. How many of you are from at least urban, suburban areas that you might, however you might define urban, suburban? Are you from larger cities or the suburbs of larger cities? How many? Not a lot, okay. So the city of Chicago, for example, it's pretty clear this is minority country. This is the white suburbs. City workers in the city of Chicago have to live in the city, so a lot of Chicago cops live in the northwest suburbs. African American school teachers, bus drivers live down here. Okay, polls, by and large, in the city of Chicago. I want to get into this in a few minutes. We're going to be talking about occupational niches and industrial niches, because one of the things that's very distinctive now and has been historically is that when immigrant groups come to our country, or any country actually, they are not a random sample of the population of that country, nor do they randomly distribute themselves in the occupational structure of the country. They focus in what we label as occupational niches, and in many cases also industrial niches. And for me as a sociologist, it's rather fascinating to block out those patterns and begin to see what those niches are and how those niches change over time. Okay? And so this is the case presently and historically, and I laugh, back in the 1920s we didn't have in sociology the expression occupational niche. So when the Irish came and began to be involved in what we might call niches now, they referred to more quaint kinds of cultural terms. They talked about the Irish Trinity, as in Catholicism, the Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. And the Trinity were priests, occupationally speaking, politicians, occupationally speaking, and policemen. That is, here were occupational niches where there were overabundant numbers of Irish in those areas. And in the city of Chicago, only fairly recently has that not been the case with the police department. And as best I remember, the name Daly is Irish, and Daly One was Irish also. The Irish are losing some control over City Hall and city politics, but by and large still run it. Okay? Let me stop for a second and see if are there thoughts, questions, concerns, ambiguities that are helpful to clarify now. Issues or questions? Sure, please.
Just to clarify, the Polish immigrants recent immigrants? The ones in
No, this particular one, we're not talking immigrants per se, we're saying Polish ethnicity, Polish heritage. So the suburban Poles, by and large, the Poles immigrated to this country, say at the turn of the century, 1895 to 1920. They're pretty much in the suburbs now, those concentrations in the far northwest. More recent immigrant Poles, say after 1965, are still pretty much in the city. Okay. And there are all kinds of fascinating things. I mean, those of you who live in rural areas and love rural areas, I kind of understand that because I live a kind of country mouse, city mouse life. I live in the city and I also live out in the country in southern Wisconsin. But urban America, and certainly in Chicago, is incredibly fascinating, not just to sociologists, but to any human being who looks around, So that one of the things that I find fascinating, I wish I could study, but there's only so much you can do. There's a Shell gasoline station in Chicago on Milwaukee Avenue. Milwaukee has been called for the longest time the Polish Broadway because it's a northwest arterial that Poles have lived on for 100 years now. And there's a Shell gasoline station on Milwaukee and Division Street, which in the summer, starting about 5 o'clock in the morning, there'll be 200 or 300 guys milling around the gasoline station, and they're looking for their neighbor. And what's also fascinating, the Polish group stands in one area, the Lithuanian group stands in another area, the African American stand in another area, etc. And all you have to do is walk into the crowd, and you get accosted by, hey, you want a plumber? Hey, you want a carpenter? Hey, you got some work for me? Etc., etc., etc. And by 10 or 11 o'clock, there might only be 50 or 60 left still looking for work. These are all day laborers who can't find full-time work. And again, it's part of the dynamics of an urban area that, as I said, is a kind of field day in a peculiar sense of that word for sociologists. Let me run you by the population. This is the labor force now, looking at labor force of immigrants only by ethnicity. So what's fascinating here is to look at 1980 for Mexican and compare it to 2000 and recognize that, say, if you've got native born, it's 39% native born, and 61% foreign born. You can see this incredible growth, a 10% shrinking by 2000, and an enormously large population, a percent also of Mexican by 2000. Nothing comparing to it in the other groups, and this is Polish again, all right, native-born immigrant, okay, Indian native-born nobody, you can't see, immigrant, okay, so a little bit of native-born 20 years later. Filipino, no native-born, some native-born, 95% native-born in 1980, 87%. Chinese, again, large numbers, small proportion of native-born, and the same Korean. One thing I should expose you to, too, is the reality of immigration itself is not the same for all groups in all kinds of different ways. And let me focus on one. Probably most of you have never heard of H-1B visas. It is immigration, and now immigration's got a new name under Homeland Security, and I keep forgetting who that is. But anyway, immigration has a status called H-1B. And H-1B is if a business or an industry can indicate that there's a lack of qualified people to do certain jobs in that business or industry, and no American workers can be found to fill those jobs, then a special status, aside from the quota for immigration in this country, is given to those kinds of potential employees for work needs. Mostly it's people with college degrees who are filling high-tech professional kinds of occupations. So there's been an enormous selective, if you will, immigration. In 1980s, for example, we had thousands and thousands of H-1B visas from India coming in as doctors. Okay. 1990s, less doctors, and H-1B visas for information technology, okay? And then what happened, and immigration didn't know this was going to happen, there's something called the Family Reunification Act. So that once immigrants are in this country, you can bring relatives under a Family Unification Act. Now, the intent was not for Indians to bring more relatives to this country. The intent, they thought, was to provide families to be unified for immigrants who came from Europe at the end of the Second World War. And all of a sudden, we not only had large numbers of doctors, information technology specialists, but relatives of Indians coming to this country under the Family Reunification Act. So that when and they're very entrepreneurial because, again, they come from specific regions of India, not randomly dispersed, and they come from regions that are known for their entrepreneurial skills. And I remember 3 years ago, I had the very bad habit of when I was driving back to southern Wisconsin, I'd stop at a Dunkin' Donut and get a cup of coffee and a couple of donuts and munch along the way as I was driving home. And every place I stopped at to get these things was Indians and Pakistanis serving me. And so I started scratching. I said, what the hell, I got a call. So I called the regional manager of Dunkin' Donuts, and I said, just experientially, I noticed an awful lot of Pakistani Indian people in Dunkin' Donuts serving me, etc. Do you have any numbers in terms of what proportion of your franchises in Chicago, the metro area, are owned or managed by Indians and Pakistanis? And the guy says, well, we don't have exact numbers. I went, nuts. He says, but it's somewhere between 84 and 86%. That's good enough, okay? 84, 86% of all Dunkin' Donuts franchises in the city of Chicago owned by Indians. Occupational niche. Chicago, the city, has about 3,000 dry cleaning establishments. Anybody know urban areas and immigrants? Who controls the dry cleaning establishments in Chicago? Who owns them? It's the same in other cities too, by the way. Same ethnic group. Korean. Of the 3,000, give or take 100 or two, dry cleaning establishments in Chicago, 2,000 roughly owned by Korean. Okay. And in construction, you talk to white guys who are in construction, you say, will you put up some drywall for me? I said, man, I don't do drywall, that's Mexican work. It's some of the least desirable work in construction. It's dirty, it's hard. White guys don't do drywall. Drywall is Mexican work. Okay. And when I give an index of representation, remember that little number I told you about, to say, are they double, 3 times the proportional representation? When it comes to the occupation of drywalls, Mexicans are 27 times overrepresented in relation to the proportion in the labor force. Okay. So, what we've got going are different immigrant groups coming with different skills, and let me introduce a couple of other terms, and different capital. When we talk about capital in sociology in particular, it makes sense and helps us not only understand, I think, but for analysis and creating a more understanding and meaning, we look at things that we call human capital, cultural capital, and social capital. And human capital, if you're not familiar, refers to things, among other things, like educational level, like occupational skills, 2 things that interest me. Social capital talks about your friendship patterns. What kinds of, that thing we call connections do you have? Cultural capital refers to, do you speak the English language? Okay. Do you understand our culture? Do you know how to file your W-2 forms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Can you process yourself in the culture? Okay. And one of the things with some immigrant groups is they come with a lot of human capital, like Filipino. So we've actively recruited for over a quarter of a century Filipinos in this country under H-1B visas. So that by and large, and I'll give you some data on that in a few moments, that by and large, Filipinos dominate the industry of healthcare in the Chicago area. as well as 6 or 8 occupations within that industry. Okay? H-1B visas, that's their niche. Selective recruitment, they have high human capital, and most Filipinos also have good cultural capital. They speak English, okay, which can be a serious problem, obviously, for immigrants who don't speak the language. So different immigrant groups come to places like Chicago and the rest of the country with different kinds of capital, and that capital produces a sorting out process in terms of what's available to them, and also, therefore, how their income is going to contribute to their own lifestyle. And so we have Indians and Filipino and Chinese who come with high human capital, and in many cases also a fair amount of cultural capital in terms of Indians speaking English, Filipinos speaking English, Chinese not. But the Chinese have come under H-1Bs also, which were recruiting crazily in the last decade because of their information mathematical skills, as most of you know, the big bias about the Chinese. They are also part of that immigrant group is filling some niches in some industries, while, for example, tolls fill very similar or dissimilar niches that are consistent with the kind of human capital they bring to our economy. So tolls, for example, mail tolls in the city of Chicago they got a lot of overrepresentation and almost dominance in non-union construction and non-union work, mostly in the suburbs in terms of building homes, putting on back porches, building garages, putting on roofs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there is I think it's biblically Jacob's quilt or Jacob's cloak, where you have all these patches put together. When you look at the occupational structure in cities like Chicago, it's a quilt of different groups, not all contributing equally across the board, but contributing different aspects of what kind of the needs are in an economy, in a labor force in places like Chicago. Some of this maybe gets a little esoteric, but one of the things, again, if we look at the label Latino, those who come from Latin cultures, speak Spanish, Mexicans are roughly 80% of all Latinos in Chicago, and nobody else comes even close, okay? The next group is Puerto Rican at 8%, and then 4% from all of South America, another 3% from Central America, 1% from Cuba, and 5% from that famous category that sociologists use all the time called other, And I remember years ago doing research in Chicago and asking somebody their ethnicity, and as I started to scratch down, he says, what did you put down there? And I said, well, you don't fit into traditional categories, you're other. He said, I don't want to be other. I'm Slovak, and put that down. Okay, I put it down and throw it away. Good old sociological research. Now, let me pick up on some themes in terms of now focusing on Mexicans and the Mexican labor force in urban Chicago. What industries are they in, and who are these people? And I'm sorry. First of all, this is the graph on the suburbanization trend. Rather fascinating, easy to read. These are 1970. What proportion of Mexicans in the city? 76%. 1980, 73. 1990, 65. 2000, 54. 2004, updated from the 2000 data I gave you, and now 46%. So you see this decline in the city, you see the rise in suburbia. So 54% of all now Latinos, not Mexicans, but Latinos also, but the majority, 80% of Latinos being Mexican, living in suburbia. Okay. And let me say a little about this. This is, I think, rather dramatic and terribly, terribly important. Here we have a simple graph. You may not even care to see the numbers, but you can see decline, 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 increase, increase, increase. And what is it? I call it Chicago's economic transformation. Okay, we're saying this is manufacturing in Chicago and the Chicago metro area, the number of jobs in manufacturing. So, and this is in thousand, so we're saying little less than 1 million jobs in 1952 in manufacturing, decline, a little rise, major decline, decline, decline. That is the loss of manufacturing jobs, the rise of service jobs, that thing we call the service economy. Okay, and knowing service jobs tend to be really bifurcated. That is, service jobs, when you go see your doctor and you have an operation, that's part of the service economy. Okay, or when somebody busses up your dishes at a restaurant, the busboy is part of the service economy. So you got the service economy is this end and a lot of things in between. So it covers a multitude of sins, and what is a colleague of mine refers to it as maddeningly ambiguous, because it doesn't really help you. It's got all kinds of stuff in that label of service economy. This is very dramatic, because one of the things it starts speaking to is this thing you probably have heard about, and if you haven't, it's like, where have you been most of your life? It's the change of our basic economy in the United States from an industrial economy to that thing labeled a post-industrial economy. An information, high technology, service economy. And that has all kinds of implications for the present and for the future, and also certainly for immigrant groups who come to this country, as well as you and me, all right? And so and one other thing I think is terribly important. By and large, when most people talk about not only going from a service economy to a post-industrial economy, we also start bringing in this other thing that's maddeningly ambiguous, called the global economy. And that begins to drive me nuts, because anytime anything goes wrong in our society, we're told by experts, well, it's the global economy, you know. I mean, it's a universal aspirin to explain everything. The global economy did it again. One of the things that's happening is job loss, as we know, manufacturing job loss. And supposedly, the largest culprit is moving jobs offshore. That is not true. The largest culprit is high technology and computer-driven technology. Okay? And let me read you some numbers that get more to the point. Okay? John, where is it? Oh, here. And I thought this was particularly relevant. I was laughing at myself when I realized I wrote this 6 months ago. I didn't know I was coming to Iowa State at the time, but I picked up an agricultural example first. Okay, and I say that when we moved from an industrial society to an agricultural society in America, we did not de-agriculturalize. Okay, I called John Deere maybe 6 months ago and asked them, what are the tractors that farmers use these days going for, and what do these tractors do? He says, well, what we have right now, he says, the top of the line that we're selling is a 500 horsepower diesel engine, self-steering tractor with 7 onboard microprocessors, a satellite-linked geopositioning system to map and locate soil conditions. He didn't tell you when it pops out, say, 24 rows of planting corn or fertilizing, each one of the plugs that is fertilizing has a sensor that goes back to a computer and tells how to mix the fertilizer to get the right mixture of fertilizer for each one of those pieces of the ground that it's covering. And as a result, okay, I'm saying today, Midwestern farmers can single-handedly, one guy, till about 3,500 acres. 100 years ago, one farmer would max out at 50 acres. Okay? We didn't de-agriculturalize. We're still the breadbasket of the world, but we have now an agricultural labor force of about 1.4, 1.2% of our entire labor force, producing everything that 300 million people roughly, I think we're just barely under 300 million right now, all the food we need, and more than that, by 1.6%. And we didn't send it overseas, we're doing it with high technology. And similarly, okay, I'm saying at the height of our manpower commitment in this country, about 32% of our labor force in the 1940s was involved in manufacturing, okay? In 2000, we're about below 13% of our labor force, okay? We went from 32 down to 13, a 20% loss. By 2012, it's projected about 9% of our labor force will be in manufacturing. Now, grab this one. That 13% of our labor force produces 11 times more goods with a 65% reduction of the labor force than it did 65 years ago. And if you see this graph, if I don't have it with me, this is a graph that looks very, very similar of productivity in manufacturing. Productivity in manufacturing has soared. That red line represents the number of workers. That's declined. We need fewer and fewer workers because it's high technology, okay, to produce massive amounts, you know. And before one of our steel plants in the Chicago area closed, I was visiting them for a couple of years. I teach courses in social work and I bring classes to steel plants. And it's always interesting, pardon me, to make fun of you guys. But we'd go to the steel plant and this huge, yellow hot ingot would come out of the blast furnace, about 20 feet long, about 8 inches thick, and maybe 4 feet wide. And it'd be from here to there. We'd be standing here, the ink would be against the wall. And the students would say, "Oh, God, it's so hot in here." Yeah? I say, "Hey, these guys work here 8 and 10 hours a day, and you're here for 30 seconds and you're moaning and groaning." Yeah? But I look around, where again the steel plant is producing, I think it was three times